Well, hello there. My name is Void Ghost, and today I'd like to answer a question. What question is that? Well, how do you start a war? And we're going to talk about how this is done nowadays and how this was done in ages past. There are some differences, yes, but not that many, as you're going to, I think, quite clearly see. Now, so first of all, uh, let's say one country wants to attack another. Why would be a reason for that? What reason would you have? Well, one of those might be you want some territory from them, right? That was a quite common one through the ages, absolutely. So you march into that country. If you win the battles, you occupy them and add their territory to yourself. Or that is what you might think. The reality is that when you occupy certain territory, you need to put in a lot of effort to maintain that occupation. They won't just switch sides, they won't switch their religion, their culture, you know. So the reality is that it could actually cost you more to occupy that territory than to just say ravage it a little, and then, well, you could destroy the facilities there. You could loot the whole place and get back to where you live with your loot, and not bother with holding that terrain. But then again, countries were quite often viewed on how much territory they actually had. And to this day, this is at least partially true. When you have a really tiny country, everybody says, "Oh yeah, that's a country, sure," and it is, of course. It has its own laws and all, but it can't just defend itself. If anyone would actually make an effort to conquer them, they will, and that's everybody knows that, right? On the other hand, you might have a country like the Russian Republic or the Russian Federation. That's a proper name, and it's huge. It's so huge that um, any estimates, if other countries would plan attacking it or have a war, and but maybe an invasion would actually do something. There's just so much territory that you would have to have millions of troops occupying that land to actually maintain any control. And that doesn't really depend on the population that would be there. It's just such a huge area. So a border dispute is one of those things that you might have as a claim. Something, that land, it's our land. So usually when you had some conflict like this, they would satisfy themselves at the end of it with taking just a little, just one province on the border of their own country. So you wouldn't have to put in a lot of effort to actually take control and maintain that control. They would partially be your people already living there. There will be a kind of mix up of two cultures, perhaps two countries, two populations, and you would just take control of that. Now, sometimes you might hear that there's a war to protect some people in another country, which might be, it might sound really ridiculous when you think about it, because when you're gonna attack another country, you're gonna bomb, uh, well, hopefully only the military facilities, but the reality is that the bridges, the factories, the power plants, whatever you have there, it's also going to be a target. So it's going to be hit in all areas. And of course, even if no civilians get in the way of all those bombs, rockets, and whatever you use, then they're going to be extremely affected by the devastation of the infrastructure. And there's always going to be some devastation of the infrastructure in such a country that's getting attacked. But what people would you exactly defend in a country that you're attacking? Well, generally, you have other populations living in countries that think of themselves as another population. So, for example, you have, well, if you look at Ukraine and the Russian occupation of Crimea, or maybe you could call it an annexation. It depends how you look at it generally. Basically, if you look at that piece of land through most of known history, it wasn't really Russian territory. There was some sort of other small nation there. These were actually guys who came with the Mongols, I think, and they would Crimean Khanate, and yeah, that's the country that was there. But eventually, it was conquered by Russia, and after a few hundred years, 200 or 300, well, basically they thought about it as Russian territory. Now, Russia always had some claims to the territory that today is Ukraine. Ukrainian independence didn't really fire off until the 20th century. But before then, you always had the nation, the Cossacks. Those were the nobility, and the Chern, those were the peasants, basically there. And, well, through a lot of known history, they were the part of the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom, but at least part of the territory was usually part of Russia or whatever form of a Russian kingdom there was. So the reality was that some of the population, the guys in the east of the country, today's Ukraine, indeed were speaking Russian, and they are to this day. So there were Russian speakers, right? Now, I'm not going to go into the genetics, who's more Ukrainian or more Russian, or has other traits of blood there. Basically, you can have a distinctive group there. You can look at it that speaks Russian and generally wasn't opposed to going back into the Russian Federation. And the Russian Federation used that basically as to legitimize their, well, you could say invasion, but you could also say annexation. From the Russian point of view, oh, they were helping the guys, the people that were living there. From anybody other's point of view, you could say, well, yeah, if I have some immigration from another nation to my country, then does that population have the right to say, you know what, we're the majority in this region, so we want to separate from your country, this part of it, and go to another? Well, no nation would actually accept that. That's the truth. So it all depends on what angle you look at it. The real reason behind that whole situation was that the Russian Federation thought that Ukraine is going to go towards them. The leader in charge suddenly took a turn away from the European Union, in which most Ukrainians wanted to get into the Union. It's a good thing to be in the Union because you basically don't have borders between countries. anymore. So you can go to Germany, to France, wherever. You want to go visit there? Okay. You want to go work there? No problem. So basically, it's like one big country, and it's a prosperous country. Of course, there are different regions, but the prosperity of those regions eventually gets higher, unless you're Greece and your government makes some very shady decisions, and that's a different topic. But basically, it was a good thing, and the Ukrainian population wanted to go there, but the guy in charge took a turn for the Russian Federation, and then they deposed them, or basically there was an uprising, you could say, and there are debates who was behind it really, what was the scale, was it a righteous thing to do or not. You could talk about it and probably take 10 people from Ukraine, random picked, and you're going to have 10 different opinions on that. At least that's what I think. But the effect was that the Russian Federation saw that it's going to lose its production capacity in Ukraine. Now, you might think, what? Its production capacity? What do you mean? Well, you see, Ukraine, not by its own choice, but after World War II, was basically totally annexed by the Russian, well, not the Russian Federation, Russia, the Soviet Republic of Russia. And during the war, they already wanted their independence. So this wasn't really something they liked. They even sided with the Germans, at least in a large part, seeing them as someone who might give them the independence they wanted. And when, after the war, they lost that, well, the situation was such that there was no possibility of breaking away from the Soviet Union. But eventually, when it collapsed on its own, the republics in it drifted away, right? They got their independence. But when you looked at the whole region of Ukraine, that was formerly one region, it had those areas of increased industrialization. So the industry there was advanced, and for the Soviet Republic, that was very important. That's where a lot of the production that went on happened, and that went to Ukraine, now a separate country. But there were still bonds between them, treaties, and the production went through one country to another. That wasn't a problem. It just, of course, they had to pay for it, but it didn't change much. The other thing was that when you look at the Black Sea, and Crimea is like this one bulge in the north, right? And the whole sea is almost totally enveloped in land. You just have the Dardanelles, so that one connection controlled by Turkey with the rest of the world. And to have control over that area, you need a base of operations for your fleet. And that it so happens that such a base was or is on the Crimea Peninsula. Now, of course, the Russian Federation did not want to lose that. They did start to build another base in their own territory this time, but this one was already there. It was big, huge, had the facilities needed to house the whole fleet. And additionally, was this a real threat or not? it's hard to say really, but from the Russian Federation point of view, this could, in theory, this base be used to house an American fleet, for example, or some other country from the European Union, for example. But I think the USA was the primary concern. So suddenly they would lose that base, and you would have the USA fleet or some portion of a fleet from the USA stationed there. And that's what kind of, yeah, well, if they really thought that would happen, I don't know. But that is the thing that was talked about on the Russian forums. So if you would look there and try to translate some of that and see what they feared, that was the rumor that went on. Okay, so that was the legitimacy of the invasion or annexation, whatever you put it, right? That was the why the Russians made the move. Now, what else can you have as a reason for invading another country? So we had border dispute, protecting people. You could also say you're stopping a dictator. So you're kind of protecting people, but this time you don't say you're going to necessarily protect the people in that country, but in other countries that the dictator might, say, attack. Now, does he really want to attack? Well, sometimes it's hard to precisely put it. If we look back, we can go as far back as the Crusades, and if you look at them and you think, what was the legitimacy of making a crusade and going there? Because sometimes you might hear someone saying, well, they want to conquer something. That wasn't the thing they were saying to the common people, to the knights that wanted to go on this holy escapade, right, to invade, but in a holy way. So how do you invade in a righteous way? How do you go far away, and how do you say it's going to be a good thing that you're participating in this? Well, there were actually a few reasons, and protecting the pilgrims was one of them. Now, does that mean that everyone in the Crusades felt that there are pilgrims they need to protect? Well, there were some pilgrims. You see, the forces controlling Jerusalem actually changed, and the previous ones were very tolerant. And if you didn't know about the different nations in the whole of Islam, then you wouldn't probably notice the change. But there was one, and Turkish, some tribe from the Turkish branch, they generally took control of that area from the Fatimids from Egypt. And what that meant is that they weren't as tolerant. So did they attack some pilgrims? Yes. Did they attack all pilgrims and no pilgrims could get there? Probably not. But some attacks would happen, and that was one of the reasons to go and get that back. And that's the second thing. Get that back? Well, yes, of course. All those lands were previously part of the Roman Empire. And of course, the Roman Empire mostly conquered every land around the Mediterranean Sea. But after a few hundred years, it was simply the Roman Empire. And all those nations were part of it. And the Roman Empire, of course, changed to Christianity, its religion. So those were Christian lands. And indeed, when you had the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire, you could say that, well, pretty much every piece of land around the whole of the Mediterranean Sea was part of one of those two. So reconquering the lands lost to the Muslims was also the legitimacy of this whole, well, of the Crusades, right? Now, if we look at a more modern example, you got Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Now, there are many bad things you can say about the guy, and you could say actually a few good things, really. Of course, he was the dictator there. He had total control, but he wasn't really an orthodox Muslim, right? He was rather tolerant there. Actually, for a long time, he wasn't showing his religion until it was basically profitable for him. And some people say, well, yeah, but there was this rebellion he put down with gas. 5,000 people died. Absolutely. He wasn't above using that. He also used gas in the Iraqi-Iranian war. Then he was actually an ally of the United States in that one. He was helped. He had satellite info, I think. Basically had some help in like backing. But the war started going bad for the Iraqis, and to stop the much larger Iranian army, he used gas at some point. And indeed, basically they settled at the borders. I think either exact borders or they maybe shifted just a little, and the war stopped. And so was he a good guy? Well, no, probably not. But he was in firm control, and because he was there, the religious groups in the area, and there were basically two major groups of Muslims there, the Sunni and the Shia, and there's not much difference between them really for someone outside of their religion. Not going too much into that. Basically, I think the only real difference there is the Sunni think that you have to be your character has to be good enough for you to be a religious figure at the top, the ruler. So if you're in charge, you just have to be a good Muslim. That's it. But the Shia think that you should have some trait of Muhammad's blood. So then some upstart, some guy who maybe thinks that he's the best one to lead, if he doesn't have that trait of blood, then that trace of blood, he doesn't have the right to lead then. Now, the proportions were, I think, 70 to 6 to 30. So the Sunni were the dominant presence. But basically, Saddam kept them in check. But, he wasn't a good guy. Absolutely. He made an invasion on a neighboring country, Kuwait. And, eventually, when the United States decided to take him down and get into that country, it was properly announced how bad of a person he is, how he oppresses other people, and he has to be removed. And of course, he had enemies, a lot of them even. And yeah, that was the reason, really. Bad guy, you need to remove him. In the process, you take control of the country. And how do you do that exactly? Because I have a few other examples, namely Hitler, for example, right? You got the Nazi Germany and other countries banding together to take them down. And what's the reason? Well, he's a threat to everybody. He's a bad guy. You got nations conquered, peoples oppressed. So you can actually make more examples, really, not just these two. But when we look at Iraq for a moment, because it's a recent thing, right? So why would you go in there, really? Well, maybe I should actually wait a moment to specify all the reasons you might want to take control of another country. But in this case, how was it done? Well, they tried to ally themselves with the opposition to Saddam. Now, when you have someone in place, then usually he has more supporters than people opposing him, right? And in this case, they had two religious groups. So as far as I know, on one side, they tried to kind of base the new government on the Shiite there. And some people running the show, there was some general that really knew what's going on and kind of took the matters into his own hands. I mean, this was an American general, and he kind of led things for a while after the fall of Saddam. And he took his National Guard. Those were the guys, 300,000 of them. They were well trained, and they were the core of the army. And suddenly they were out of a job, and he saw this was a rather dangerous situation. So he basically hired a lot of them. But then, for some reason or another, from some program I saw, I know that this is most likely because the politicians that got into office later on didn't exactly understand the situation. They kind of said they moved the general somewhere else, and then they started doing things their own way, and then suddenly you had attacks daily from Al Qaeda, which wasn't really there. And you can go into the naming process of the group. Is it really something from the whole world? Was it really there? Was it invented? The name, whatever you call it, whatever you say about it, insurgents from other countries started shifting to Iraq and attacking the American forces. The reason? Because the shift in policy, basically. And a lot of those guys from the National Guard that were hired and suddenly stopped being hired probably joined them. So that's the thing. Now, so we kind of went through most reasons that you can have to attack another country. Of course, there's conquest, total conquest, like, oh yeah, we're going to take over that country. But as I said, this happened a long time ago. But then you had this situation where it just started costing more than it gave you. And the conquering was on a much smaller scale. And basically, even if you look at Nazis in World War II. And you think, well, didn't Hitler try to take the whole of Europe? Well, first of all, he had allies. They drifted towards him for different reasons. They usually didn't really like him that much because what he was saying was oriented on Germany only. But there was a big red threat from the east. That's the Soviet Republic. And they started attacking countries. And for example, Romania, which was neutral to, I think, 1940, suddenly, or maybe 41 even, they had a situation where a Russian army appeared on their border and said, you know what, we want your border province now. Because one time before, it was actually part of our nation, and we want that province back, because it should be ours. And do you oppose? And if they would, then that would be a total invasion of their country. So they said, no, take Bessarabia for yourself, of course. And then they quickly allied with Germany. And yeah, that's how they ended up in the German camp. There was also there were others. Hungary, for example, there was a change in government, basically, and the new government kind of drifted towards the German army. There were other allies, but when you look at why Nazi Germany tried to attack other, or did it really want a war like that? Well, no. First, they occupied Czechoslovakia, and that's the Czech Republic. But today it's two different countries, and they used a region. You see, there were, after World War One, Germany lost a lot of territory. Now, some of that territory was, for example, the piece of Poland that 200 years ago they snatched, and in a tandem with Russia and Austria. So those three countries basically ripped Poland apart, and Poland emerged after World War I again on the map. Some of the land bordering France, this was a province, I think at some point in history it was part of Germany, then it might have been part of the French kingdom. Eventually, before World War I, it was German territory, but then they lost it, or it was disputed territory at least. There were also territories in the south. One province was even lost to Italy. So there was this, you see, Italy didn't know exactly if Hitler is going to press for them to give that province back. But eventually he wanted to have peace with Italy and ally with them. So basically he said, okay, you can keep it. And that wasn't really a popular move in Germany. But, well, that was something that he and his his advisors thought is necessary, of course. So what was the legitimacy of invading the Czech Republic, for example? Well, what he said, Hitler, that is that there are a million Germans living there, and they're oppressed by the Czech. Now, there were, of course, those million Germans, and they were left over in that territory when the territories were separated from Germany. It was actually Germany and Austria-Hungary, which was a huge country on its own, and basically all of that territory was part of it. So some Germans, of course, lived there, and it's kind of quite similar to that Ukrainian invasion or annexation by the well, not whole Ukraine, of course, just Crimea, that you can see here, right? There's the similarity, right? What else did he say? Well, quite obviously, he said, if before World War One, certain territories were part of Germany, then they should be part of Germany again. And the moves he made were exactly for those territories. Of course, as I said, there weren't always German territories, like the big piece of Poland, and he didn't really want the hope of what was formerly German and was now Poland, but he wanted enough to kind of make the Polish side say no, basically. And I could go into that for a long, long time, but why attack France? Well, he didn't, because when the invasion of Poland started, then France and Great Britain, well, actually not exactly then, but 3 days later, they declared war on Germany, which didn't actually thrill his cabinet, his advisors, that is Hitler's. Actually, there was a long silence, and Goering, the chief of the Air Force, said, God help us if we lose this war. Yeah, and indeed, it was kind of profitable. You could say that he estimated the situation properly. Of course, they thought that they might not have much success invading France, but France had took huge losses in manpower in the previous war, and the defenses they were building for the last few years didn't reach all the way to the sea. So they had the Maginot Line, but it was very weak on the border of the defenses, at least. Some do not consider that the part of the line, but they did plan to build more defenses there on the border with Belgium. They knew that Germany is going to probably go through Belgium. And what do you know? They did. And, well, it turned out that superior tactics won the day. And basically the Nazis were surprised, really. To the degree that, sometimes you hear that, just one move more and they could have invaded Great Britain, for example, right? Well, they couldn't because they didn't have the naval power. It's not even just putting up the ships to transport the troops. It's securing the water that you want to move them through. And when the enemy, in this case Great Britain, has a huge fleet, you gotta either chase that fleet away or destroy it. So it's not probable that they would have a way to invade, right? So they overstretched in a way, and they had more success than they even expected. So why did they attack Russia? Well, Russia was kind of making moves that showed it is going to attack Germany. And again, whole different video about that. But oh no, if you look at the size of claims that the Nazis made, they didn't really plan to occupy the northern France region, for example, forever. They thought, the war's going to end, maybe a few years more, and eventually they're going to pull back their forces. Maybe take just a little bit, from the border region. That's it. Get those territories they lost. That was pretty much. And I don't even think that they thought about colonies they lost. So in Hitler's mind, he didn't want to conquer the whole of Europe. He just wanted to get a little of land. You see, that's the thing. That was pretty much the time period where taking permanent control of other countries was kind of out of style. You didn't really do that. Now you could say, well, what about Russia? Didn't it try to attack Finland? Didn't attack Finland, but kind of got beaten back. Well, actually, it won. It took enormous losses. And what they did then was take just the border area with the defenses. So if they wanted to, Russia that is, attack again, there would be no defenses blocking them. So they were in a position to strike, but they didn't really think about Finland. They thought about Sweden, which was neutral, but it was supplying Germany with iron ore, very good quality iron ore. So that was one of the things that Germany needed to sustain its war effort. The other thing was oil. Well, where did Germany get its oil? Half of it came from Romania, which I already mentioned. Yes, that border area, it didn't matter. It didn't really have oil in it. So why did they want it? They didn't want it. They wanted to take control of the whole country, and therefore Germany would lose half its oil supply, or the provider of half its oil that they used each year. So what else? You got republics, the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Estonia, and the third one. Latvia. That's how you pronounce it in English, I think. So basically, they took those republics. By took, I mean they invaded and occupied it. And you could say, well, wait, didn't you say that that wasn't something that you really did then? Well, yeah, but you see, these areas were sort of tiny compared to Russia. And they could generally occupy those territories. They were so small that this wasn't a big strain. But why would you do that? Why would you take some 3 small countries? Why? Because then Russian forces could get just to the border of Prussia. And that was the most eastern German territory from before the war. So now they could attack it outright, not go through any other country or territory. So Germany generally saw all that, right? And yeah, that's probably why they invaded. But basically, you can see that it wasn't really about taking huge amounts of land. Sometimes maybe some crucial, some essential little piece. That's it. Now, what is the reality? Let's just summarize it of an invasion. Because you're not doing it because you want to help some people. You don't want to topple the dictator that's in there. I mean, you can say, oh, okay, we're going to bring you democracy or something. But the dictator there, if he's your ally, if he's doing things as you want them to be done, you're not going to attack him. It doesn't matter what he does. You're just not going to make a move. So in reality, well, one thing is influence over a region. So if you put in charge your government. Oh, and by the way, let me tell you how the Romans did it. You see, the Romans were, of course, they got more and more territory, more and more forces, more and more legions, right? But in any given situation, in any given war, their forces were, of course, limited. They had a few legions here, and they wanted to occupy a territory. And how did they do it? Well, they moved in the region, and then they found they usually contacted the weakest faction there, and they allied themselves with those guys. And now, what that gave them was some allies in the region that know the region, know the customs, etc. And they could always say, you know what, we're just backing those guys up. And it's not like we want to take control of the whole country. They want to, well, don't they have the right? Right? Those other guys were in charge now, but we think these are this is the better choice. And we're helping them. And after that, well, you could kind of say, okay, yeah, we're not sure anymore. But the Roman power added to that local power was usually enough to basically conquer the region and just destroy all the enemies. And then they put that weak faction in power. But its power was based on Roman power. So when you put such a marionette government in charge, they will do what you want because you're the guy with the army. They can't survive on their own. They know that. And maybe the situation is going to change after a while. But in Roman times, after a while, extensive building, trade, Romanization would make the population feel more and more Roman. And eventually they wouldn't want to rebel because they would think of themselves as Roman. Now, was that something that happened in recent years? Well, maybe not exactly that, but marionette government, oh yeah, those are things you can make them in a number of ways, but basically you're helping one way or another some faction in a different country to gain power. How are you helping them? Well, maybe you invaded the country, just put them in power, sure, but maybe you kind of backed them up politically. Maybe you said, we're going to be helping you, and then you did. But that faction had that help, and what do they give you in return? And this is one of those things you never really mention when you invade somewhere. But if there's oil or some other resource that you want, well, what, you're going to take control of those oil fields? Of course not. That's not how you do it. Not anymore. In the ages past, yes, you could take control of some resource like that, but that's not how you do it nowadays. You take your companies and you give them the right to extract that resource. And of course, some of that money is going to go to the forces governing the country, but you can press them to do with that money whatever you want them to do with that money. You can exploit that resource to the amount you want because they will do what you want now. So you want to increase the oil production? Okay. You want them to lower the amount of money they have to take from those companies, or they want to take. Sure. You want to make them invest that in some sort of army, militia, or whatever, maybe infrastructure, actually, because you want to make the oil extraction process smoother. Okay, they're going to do whatever you want, really, because you're the reason that they are in power. And without you, they are probably going to collapse. And if you look back in the 50s, 60s, you had some governments put in place, and this wasn't after a war or anything, but these governments were usually in South America, and they were basically working against their countries for, well, usually American interests. And there's some guy who worked for the CIA, and he actually wrote a book about this, which was a while ago a shocker, but now basically everybody knows that when a big country with a lot of force comes and says, do this, invest in that, yeah, maybe it's a good thing you listen to them, but you also have to think about the possibility that in the end they want to make you extremely reliant on them. So because you're going to invest so much money in, say, whatever, maybe your infrastructure, without them actually doing, let's say, oil extraction or some other resource extraction, that infrastructure is not going to do anything. So you invested money, but you're not going to get it back. And your country is, for example, going to really suffer for that, collapse even. And those situations happened. And, well, that is one of the reasons. And it's a big one. Everybody kind of knows that, oh, there's oil. But they don't really go into specifics of what does that mean. You go help out some people and remove the power-hungry dictator, and you kind of put in other people in charge, and then you're in control of that resource. But how does it work? Well, just as I told you now. Now, there's also another thing that is, well, you may want to have some direct control over a region, which means that you will have some sort of bases in the region. Army bases, Air Force bases, ports, military ports, right? And you will have troops stationed in there. And of course, the government in charge will allow that. You will make sure of them signing any agreements that you need. After World War II, the USA actually was left with a lot of regions where it could put some bases, and they are there to this day. There's quite a few in Germany, there's quite a few in Japan, and other regions, really. Now, some of them were kind of the effect of occupying the territory and then leaving soldiers to secure it, right? Others are the effect of kind of aligning yourself with a country, and they let your forces stay there. And that's kind of what's happening in Poland, for example, right now. You get more and more forces, American forces in Poland. Why? Because theoretically you could have some sort of invasion from the Russian Federation. I guess that's the reason, but the reality of it is that that's probably not going to happen. ever. But yeah, you wanna put your forces somewhere. That's gonna cost you usually. Okay, so either you make the people owning the country, where those forces are going to be pay for their upkeep, or maybe you're just fine with taking control of that area, but in reality also paying for your forces being there. Now, so let's just talk about for a moment. It's a pretty long video already. Sorry, but let's just talk about how do you actually start a war. So what do you do? Well, you kind of have a few options. One is to provoke that other side to make the first move. Now, you may have heard about the Russian Federation against Georgia. Yeah. And maybe you heard about Ossetia mentioned there. Now, what all that means is Georgia was generally an independent country for most of known history. But eventually, the Soviet Republic annexed it. And what happened after it fell apart was that Georgia actually separated itself, of course, from the main Russian territory. But there's this little tiny piece. You see, you have a mountain ridge here. So you got mountains. They're big, and they basically block troop movement. And they go from west to east. And the thing is that Russia, the Soviet Republic, made tunnel underneath one of those mountains. So they made a tunnel. It's big, and you can send tanks through, right? So you can move forces through there. And on the other side, the Russian Federation today has one small region. Now, honestly, I don't know if this was part of the country or it was part of Russia or not. It's called Ossetia, and basically most of the population there is Russian, right? And it is part of the Russian Republic or the Russian Federation, or maybe it's kind of has some sort of treaty with it. Whatever the case, Georgia decided, or the leader of it, that they can't tolerate this that much, and they kind of there was a dispute there. But then, at one point, Russia, or the Russian Federation, moved its forces right to the border, so about to that tunnel, I think. And I don't know if they moved it through it and on the other side of the mountains, or just on their side. But in effect, Georgia thought that they are actually attacking. And they responded to this move of troops by firing, apparently. So they started firing, and, well, the Russian forces broke through. They devastated the country for the next, I think, 2 weeks. And then they pulled out. And that's one of the other reasons why you might invade a country, to devastate it. Now you might think, why would you do that? Well, you might have a neighbor that you think is never really going to be liking you, not in the near future. So if you go in there and basically destroy everything you can which is some sort of infrastructure, then you're gonna cause enough problems for them to not thinking about. They won't think about backing someone attacking you, or make a lot of fuss or problem for you. And one of those situations you can see in Lebanon. And again, a few years back, you had an Israeli-Lebanon conflict, and it basically started with a group. Was it Hamas? I think it might have been. So there's a group of anti-Israeli militants, and they were, at least at that point, stationed in Lebanon. Now, Lebanon was not so long ago a Christian country, but that kind of changed, and I'm not going to go into that. But it was long, brutal, and there were a lot of people moving in and a lot of people dying involved. But now there is a Christian population, but I think it rapidly went down. So whatever the situation was before, now Israel doesn't really see that region, I think, as a potential ally, but as a potential threat. And indeed, those militants were stationed there, and they kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers. So Israel started kind of an invasion, but they just went not so far in with ground troops, and then they started firing guided missiles to targets. So those were precision strikes. Of course, civilians, of course, died too. But when you look at what they actually hit, bridges, power plants, you name it, any infrastructure that actually the civilians used was also targeted. So it wasn't just aimed, this attack, at military structures. And eventually they put out and left the country devastated. So this isn't something unheard of. Just as I said before, you could, in the ages past, you could kind of rob that country and take some plunder. Nowadays, you don't really have anything to take from her, but you can think of leaving it a smoldering ruin. Of course, that would also create problems, like refugees going perhaps across the border to your own country from there. Because suddenly that place over there turned into a hellhole, and maybe they even are willing to come and work or live in your country because your country, well, it functions there. Well, their country might have just stopped functioning because of you. So that is one of the reasons for invasion. And again, you will not hear this in any news saying why. There's always going to be some other nice reason, right? Saving people, fighting a dictator, not devastating that other country or taking control of resources in said country, for example. Now, what are the reasons why you can say you invade? One of them, as I said, was the provocation. So you make a move, they shoot first, aha. But you can also make stuff up. You can say, well, our forces were shot at by those guys, and maybe even stage something. And this was done so many times, really. Either it was totally made up, like, for example, the invasion of Vietnam. Well, protection of sovereign Vietnam by the US forces. Generally, Vietnamese torpedo boats, I think, were supposed to attack some ships, but that wasn't really the case. I mean, it didn't happen, apparently. At least the programs I saw said it never happened. It was a fabricated claim, totally. But that was the reason for invading Vietnam. What about, for example, Hitler invading Poland? Well, he had a number of these. Basically, he took some of his troops and put them in Polish uniforms, and they did a number of things. Took control of a radio station, of a post office. I mean, those are tiny things, right? But if you take those tiny things and you show it everywhere and say, look what they did. Of course, they took pictures of themselves. You got your claim. You say, they fired first. They started this, Maybe you provoked them, but they did that. And of course, in this case, it wasn't them at all, right? So other stuff, you can also have things that were, say, a mistake, or you can just put them in some perspective. So, for example, when you look at the United States joining World War One, now it was the states were ready to do that, but one of those things that legitimized that in joining, right, was the torpedoing of, I think it was the Lusitania or the Britannic. No, I think it was the Lusitania. Now, the thing is, Germany absolutely did that, and a German U-boat, so a submarine, right? They didn't mistake it for anything. It was ordered to hit all shipping, and it did. And it sent one torpedo because that's how many it had. And then survivors said there were, or was it the crew? I think the crew kind of said that, well, yeah, and there were 2 explosions. And then the Allies got like very defensive about this. What? No, there was 1 explosion. That's a lie. Of course, Germany didn't really understand. Why would they kind of get upset about that? And the thing is, it transported munitions and had some cannons on board, but those were like inconsequential to this, right? You don't detonate them by sending it to torpedo in, but what Great Britain thought is that those munitions were detonated. That didn't happen. They got to the wreckage in previous years, and it didn't explode. There was some sort of other reason, probably certain doors that should have been closed were open, and the flooding water got to the, either it detonated the dust from the coal, or it got to the engines, and there was explosion when they were flooded. Whatever the reason, that was the second detonation, really. But of course, neither Great Britain nor the United States knew that, and Germany didn't know that also, of course. But from a perspective, we can say that was actually a legitimate target if some vessel transports munitions. So if you actually lost someone, like a relative on that ship, you might think about pressing some sort of charges against perhaps, you might have some compensation for that loss of life, because it was basically the responsibility of the nation that sent that ship, in this case the USA, to not sneak munitions aboard and make this potentially a target of the enemy in this case, right? So, but I could, of course, go into other, maybe one more. When Japan invaded, I think, Manchuria, or maybe it was China, but I think it was Manchuria. They kind of fabricated this, some border skirmish, an explosion of some railroad tracks, or was there actually a train involved? I'm not sure. It was something minor again, right? But it was enough to say, oh, look, they did that. So now we attack. So you need some sort of reason like that to start this whole thing. But you have one third reason. This is something big, usually, and you can turn this to your advantage however you like. So some sort of catastrophe. Of course, it has to be man-made. And is it a legitimate attack, or is it something you kind of show in a way? Whatever the case, you use that. And this is, there's a saying that you shouldn't let a good catastrophe go to waste. And this is a saying by politicians. They sometimes repeat that. And it's a good saying, actually. Not something you want to tell your voters, right? But it's actually on the spot. And the biggest case in the latest years would be the World Trade Center. After the attacks, whatever you say about them, it was basically used as leverage to make all Americans want some sort of revenge, right? And that revenge was directed at Afghanistan. And of course, you could say, well, yeah, Osama was in there, right? The Taliban was there. And of course, if you look closer, you also see this. The Taliban are evil, which, yeah, of course, they executed people publicly. They oppressed women, really. Basically blocked education for women, I think. So you could say they blew up monuments that weren't Muslim. And as in Islam, you can't really make statues, you see, because you can't make something that represents God. And this limits whatever architecture or paintings or whatever you have in Islam to really, it really limits that. So there were Buddha statues, ancient as almost no other thing that we know about, I think, or very few at least. And they were there for 10,000 years, something like that. It was a huge amount of time. And they were carved into sides of mountains, and they blew them up at some point. There was some sort of attempt at restoration. I don't know if they were restored or not, but yeah, whoever does that in my book, they are indeed anti-human, as I would put that. So were these guys bad? Sure, absolutely. You could say that, but of course, from their point of view, they defended their religion and etc. But the thing is, after that first invasion, there was also the Iraqi invasion, and one of the reasons given for that one was also the attacks of 9/11. Now you could say, wait a second, what did Saddam had to do with those? Well, I would say probably nothing. He actually even sent his condolences and after the attacks, but as you see, it didn't really matter. They had enough rage to direct somewhere to make another invasion. Basically, of course, there were more claims like he has weapons of mass destruction, which applies to you have a power-hungry dictator, and we will take that bad dictator down. And he also attacks people, gases people very bad. Additionally, you could also mention Assad in Syria and the whole uprising there. At some point early on, it's quite probable that he used gas. I'm not sure if that happened, but it might have happened indeed. But then, after the conflict went on and on, there was, the rebels basically, there were two factions of rebels, kind of. One supported by the USA and one basically being Orthodox Muslim and trying to ISIS. You surely heard about the guys. Now the thing is, Assad was presented as, a power-hungry dictator that was in charge. So the rebels were, of course, good at first, but then it became clear what ISIS is. That is a bunch of rather extreme fanatics. And, the situation was this. Assad forces, backed by the Russian Federation forces, basically pushed back a lot of those rebels, whatever rebels they were. And in effect, you could have, there were regions occupied by the rebels, there were regions occupied by Assad. And at some point, you got the salvo of munitions containing gas. And suddenly some small town was partially gassed, attacked with gas. And they said, oh my goodness, it's Assad. And of course, Trump, I think, went and said, oh yeah, he used gas. And then every official, American official, Western official, basically said that. And there's just one thing they kind of skipped. And I don't think they forgot about it. They skipped it on purpose. You see, Assad doesn't have gas weapons, not anymore. Before that event, a year back or 2 years, he invited a commission from the UN and said he wants to dispose of all his gas weapons. Of course, the Russian Federation, they nudged him in that direction, but it was a good move because what are you going to do? Use those weapons, really? That's suicide, basically. Everybody's going to think you're a monster for doing that, and you're not going to do anything, really. So he actually gave up all of that, and they supervised that. That means that they went wherever they wanted, checked everything, okay? And through the course of several months, I think, they destroyed all his gas weapons, all of them. They just generally stated that with total certainty. And suddenly, there's a gas attack. Now, of course, the rebels took possession of some of that munition when it was still laying around, and they were taking bases, etc. And you don't have to think much about it, no matter what you think about Assad, that attack just couldn't have happened from his side. And if you even didn't know about him getting rid of his gas weapons, well, then you could think, did he have something to gain from that? Was he going to get what? Would the rebels suddenly run away because gas? No, of course not. It's like shooting yourself in the foot, basically, showing everybody, you're a monster. You need to be fought against. So yeah, logically that couldn't have been him. Yet somehow the Western press kind of forgot about the facts here. And you're going to see that happen whenever there's a war they want to push you into. And you're going to see that other nation that maybe you didn't know even existed if you're not good in geography, because it was never mentioned. You could find it somewhere on the map, but now you start hearing about it, that it's evil, or sorry, the guy in charge is evil, the people there are oppressed, and maybe that's true. But why didn't uh, your country make a move right before that? Well, there was no reason, but now they want to invade. So now you're gonna hear about evil dictator, oppressed people. Usually those facts are gonna be there. Weapons of mass destruction, absolutely, absolutely. So what two countries are in danger of being the next on the invasion plan? Well, Iran and North Korea. And actually, in both cases, the efforts to invade were kind of blocked. And in both cases, kind of by the Russian Federation. Now, you see, or at least in Iran's case, you see a problem in an invasion if you have an advanced force like the states have, is if the defending country has some good anti-aircraft and anti-missile system. And you don't just produce those, you have to basically buy them from someone who developed them, who put in a lot of effort to make the best they can. And it so happens that the Russian Federation heavily invested in those systems, and of course it provided Iran with some of them. And I don't know if there was actually a transaction made, if they actually sold those systems. This is the S300 or S400. The 400 is a better one, the newer one. And I'm not sure if the transaction was made, but there was a lot of fuss about them announcing that they will sell the system to Iran. Did they eventually? Maybe. I'm not sure. But it looked like an invasion was about to happen. Like forces were in place, they were doing some sort of maneuvers. Even there was some sort of it kind of looked like the states were pushing in that direction. The same for Syria, and here I think it was even more advanced, the plans of potential landing of troops. And why would that be? Well, you won't hear this talked about, not much, but there were two things. First of all, there was some sort of note somewhere in the net on some portals, and then it just kind of got lost in there. That two cruise missiles were fired by USA forces and they were trying to hit something in Syria, and they were shut down. By who? By Russian forces. And there were some statements like, I think they were talking about Soviet bases, and this was by some commander of the Soviet forces there. But he said that that territory is going to be defended as Moscow, which is the capital of the Russian Federation. So basically, he said, if you attack, we're going to fight with everything, right? And then there was another incident when Trump was in power. That was after the gas attack. That was after that, I think. 49 cruise missiles were fired. I think that was the number, or maybe it was 52 of something like that. And they were almost all of them were shut down by anti-missile defense systems deployed in Syria by the Russians. Those missiles were aimed at the American missiles, or they might have been Tomahawk missiles. Basically, they were fired from a ship, and they were aimed at an airfield. And there were a few hits, but that was mostly because the defense systems couldn't keep up with shooting down all of those aerial targets, right? So they had anti-missiles of their own, but there was a limited amount of them. And that's why some of them actually went through. But it kind of, I think you can clearly see it was a test. Like if most of them would go through, that would mean that the Russian Federation doesn't really have the means to stop such an attack. But it turned out it actually had. Lately, you hear about drone attacks. They're small drones, and of course, yeah, that's a very good method because it's cheap. If you can actually make a cheap attack that doesn't cost you almost anything, and the losses that your enemy sustains are going to be substantial, what's not to like about it, right? Unless you're the defending side with the superior technology. That kind of gets irritated by such attacks. Well, anyway, I think that kind of covers the subject. And as you see, our world, you might have thought that it's stable, it's not going to change, but someone always told you, probably here and there, that there's always some sort of war in the world. But you always probably thought, oh yeah, but some two small nations somewhere over there, but that's not exactly the case. The big guys are pushing others to war or invading or doing stuff, and sometimes it's a proxy war with someone else's hands, but more and more you see this big conflict. Mostly it's the United States against the Russian Federation. You can also see China there, and it's also against the United States, but those are rather moves by military means, but not actually waging a war anywhere. So China built a base on some islands that the United States say they didn't have a good claim to, but of course China was seeing things a different way, and this kind of helps them spread their influence over the neighboring seas. So I think I kind of told you even more than you wanted to know. Sorry for making this video so long. I could split it in a few parts. Maybe one day I'll do that, but you would anyway have to see all of them to make sense of it, right? So, as usual, if you liked it, even little, like it. And thank you for watching.